This meeting is being recorded.
I think I just verified the recording's working, so I think we're good to go.
Perfect. Are you using the microphone here?
From
That
here.
one's muted?
Muted, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Do you want to manage this, or do you need any help?
I think we're good.
Do you want to go full screen?
Pardon me?
Do you want to go full screen?
Full screen, right? Yeah, sure.
Double click. And then you can click here to hide the participants,
Okay. Right.
or click here to hide. You can close here the chat. So we can give a little more space for you.
Great. I think
You can change the presentation mode to. Okay, there's no one present, so that's okay.
right.
Do you want to position this a little further?
Yes, a little bit further back because some people are going to be right over here.
Like so?
Yeah, good. Okay, so Adrien, if you could come up.
Yeah.
You said that you emailed you emailed me your slides. Is that right? Yeah.
And
Just- Okay. So that's what I'm just doing. Okay, I'll just do that. Yeah.
right now, like that was doing
Okay.
I think that good kids are the easiest to think they are but they're the easiest because they are very resilient. And they learn from the process. So for my case, we left with them in 2017, we went to Italy. And then we stayed there in 2020, they moved here. And so they again, I mean, yeah, they can play sports, but now you see they speak fluently Italian, they speak fluent English, they go to international school here. My daughter just graduated from high school this week. She's thriving, like really, also so they are completely international, open-minded, you know. So you think that
All right. I think I can get started now. Assuming this is done well.
they can work.
Yeah. I would take that.
Yes. But you shouldn't do it.
Okay, got it. All right, welcome to the 5th annual Integrated Food Ontology Workshop. It's a great pleasure to have this going this year and to have all of you in person here and a full day of talks lined up. A few things to say. It's happening as part of FOIS 2024 at the University of Twente in Scheide, Netherlands. And I have a couple of organizational documents here. This document with its little bit.ly address, I can enlarge that. And then this is happening at Zoom, and I see we've got about 4 or 5 online participants there right now. The day is filled with a couple of sessions with 4 talks and then a couple of lighter sessions. We'll try to keep it. Pardon me?
Unmute yourself. Because you cannot hear. It's muted.
Oh,
Just press the button. That's the button.
this one. Yes. Oh, right. Of course. Thank you. I guess I can repeat that later when I add this thing. So I've got this Google Doc here for questions and notes during the presentations, which you can add items to for your note-taking and for any of the online folks who want to get a question in. Better to do it that way than to put it in the chat. Okay, so for the first speaker, I actually have Adrien Barton, who's going to give us a talk on what is food. And he has a master's degree in mathematics and physics at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon and a PhD in philosophy of science at the University Paris. And beyond Sorbonne, Adrien is now National Center for Scientific Research, researcher at the Toulouse Science Research Institute. And his work deals mostly with philosophical basis of ontologies development by ontologies. And I've had a great pleasure of working a little bit with him. He's led it, an investigation that's really helping food on the question of what is food. So over to you, Adrien, to dive into this subject, and I'll bring up your PowerPoint slides here. I'll screen it. So, configure this microphone. Okay. And so there's the camera, that's the mic, and this is the scrollable screen. Yeah. Let's see if we can get rid of some of this junk here. What's that? So, right. So this is showing there, right? Okay. Is that good? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Damion. Hello, everyone. So I'm Adrien Barton, and I'm going to present to you, as Damion explained, joint works that we did together and with Fuyaki Toyoshima about this very general question: what is food? With a view on this based on the notion of realizable entities or potentialities, as I'm going to explain. So, this work has been made in the context of providing basis for food ontology, developed by Damion and many other people. And so in the context of the IFOW, this set of interoperable ontologies. So the question here, the starting question is that what is common among the various things we eat? Because it seems that there is such a huge diversity here. And as I say that we are going to explain it in terms of potentialities of food. So what food can do. And there is an entity, a class of entity in the basic formal ontology, BFO, which is the foundational ontology mostly used in the Obo Foundry. So there is an entity which is relevant for that, which is the class of realizable entity, which is, for those who know, a continuum, more specifically, a specifically dependent continuum. And so a realizable entity is a property that can be realized by some processes when its bearer is in some circumstances. But this realizable entity exists even if it's not realized. So I'm going to give a few examples in a minute, but just to have an overview, in the first part, we're going to speak about food-related dispositions, where dispositions is a kind of realizable entity. In the second part, I'm going to speak about food role. Role is another kind of realizable entity. And then in the third part, we're going to come back to this general question of defining what is food. So let's see the first example of realizable entities, which are dispositions. So dispositions, they are realizable entities, to put it simply, that exist because of the physical structure of their bearer. So for example, a glass is fragile. It has a disposition of fragility, which can be realized by the glass breaking when the glass is in some circumstances. There is some kind of pressure on it, etc. Solubility of the salt is another kind of disposition.
the flammability of a match is another kind of disposition, and all these dispositions exist because of the physical structure. So, for example, the flammability of a match exists because of the chemical structure of the head of the match and then of the wood which is going to burn. So, what are relevant dispositions for food? There are many dispositions that can appear in food, but 3 of them will be more relevant. And the first one is edibility. So edibility has been defined by the Organoleptic ontology battle as follows: as a physical quality inherent in a beer by virtue of the beer's disposition of being fit to be consumed. So here we have a slightly different take on that, because we see that edibility here is considered as a quality, but etymologically it should rather be the disposition. And also, when you say being fit to be consumed, the question is who is going to consume? Because of course, something can be fit to be consumed, let's say, by humans, but not by dogs, or vice versa. So, and the notion of being fit can be analyzed in terms of risk, but I'm not going to enter into. So, rather than that, we could introduce the notion of edibility for humans and for any kind of species, which is a disposition of being fit to be consumed by a typical human. So here you have the notion of typical human. Why? Because, of course, as we know, there is a lot of variability between humans, in particular allergies. So what is fit to be eaten by some person might not be fit for another person. So you might want to fine-grain a bit further and speak of the edibility for a person P1, for a human P1, a disposition of being fit to be consumed by P1, or by any kind of organism for that matter. Okay, now edibility is a disposition which can appear and disappear. For example, if you consider raw cassava, it's toxic, but if cooked, it becomes edible. So raw cassava has a predisposition to become edible. It's not edible, but it has a predisposition to become edible. A disposition to develop a disposition. Grape, or mostly any food for that matter, have a predisposition also to become inedible. Here I put a reference to a relevant paper by Andrea Borghini and Michaela. So, edibility, of course, is a matter of degree and of quantity. Some people have this habit of eating soil or chalk that exists, which is edible in some quantity. It will not raise some risk, or only a low risk. So here, like you might want to have a fuzzy notion of edibility. And to take more like common examples, if you consider apple seeds or saffron or fugu, well, here you have also a matter of degree in edibility of those materials. Now, what is relevant in terms of food, most of the time, is not really edibility, but rather partial edibility. Because in many food, we don't consume typically, let's say, the shell or the kernel. So partial edibility is a disposition borne by a material entity of having a part being fit to be consumed by a typical human. So when we speak of edibility, from now, it will rather be partial. Okay, that was the first relevant disposition. Second one is nutritiveness. And here again, we can speak of nutritiveness for a species, let's say humans, a disposition borne by a material entity that is realized by providing nutrients when being consumed by a typical human. So where edibility characterizes the absence of negative consequences, nutritiveness characterizes rather the presence of positive consequences. And they are conceptually independent of each other. Like you can have, for example, many pills, drug pills are edible to some extent, but not nutritious. And if you consider like a poisoned food, poisoned apple, let's say here, is nutritious, but it is not edible. Those are both independent. Finally, the third relevant disposition here will be palatability. So palatability for humans, we define it as a disposition borne by a material entity that is realized by providing a positive organoleptic experience when being consumed by a typical human. And so the kind of positive organoleptic experience can be in terms of taste, let's consider umami, for example, aroma, but it can be also in terms of temperature, or it can be in terms of texture. So there are many aspects in organoleptic experience. And of course, as we well know, palatability is very cultural and individual, relative. Just consider a few of these examples: surströmming, durian, licorice, marmite, natto, cilantro, or of course, Hawaiian pizza. So, palatability depends on the circumstance, which means that maybe technically it's not exactly a disposition in the FO sense, but in a more general sense, but I'm not going to explain that here, but we touch a bit about this on the paper. So, for example, some wine might, provide a better organoleptic experience when paired with some food, or, lemon might taste better if you have eaten miracle fruit, which change the taste of acidity into sweetness. Now, as I said, there are like plenty of food-related dispositions. You have other ones, like, the capacity to create psychoactive effect for alcohol, for example, energizing effects for coffee, many possible dispositions. But the thing is that among the three that we saw, sorry, this slide is a bit dense, you don't have to read it, it's just to say that we have provided examples showing that they are all conceptually independent, right? So edibility, nutritiveness, and palatability. You have examples of food which are one but not the other, etc. So here the 8 possible combinations are represented. Okay, now let's switch to food role. So here we define the notion of appropriate food role as a role of a material entity of a type that is generally considered by some community as appropriate for consumption by ingestion in order to fulfill nutritional needs and or to provide organoleptic experiences. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but here we see at the end that we have again nutritiveness and palatability, which appear kind of, but not directly, right? I mean, this is really like a social role, which is not the same kind of entity as a disposition. It's just that those dispositions appear in the definition. And we're going to give a few examples to clarify this definition. So, for example, an apple is a material entity. So this apple is a material entity of a type, the type apple, which is generally considered by some community, let's say, well, many human communities, as appropriate for consumption, to provide nutrients or to provide organoleptic experiences. It is relativized twice, this role. First, because, of course, what is considered as appropriate for human might not be considered as appropriate for cat or vice versa. And also because who is considering that it's appropriate? Like some community might consider that some, product is appropriate for consumption, and some other community might consider that it's not appropriate for consumption. So roles, in a sense, are relational entities. So here we're going to speak of roles, but if we want to have a more fine-grained analysis, you should rather introduce the relations which are beyond, which define these kind of roles. So they are the most primitive entities here. So, example, we can see the relativity of appropriateness, like consider pork ribs, might be considered as appropriate, for consumption to bring nutrients by a community of omnivore people, but not by a community of vegan people, Jewish people, Muslim people, etc. Human flesh might be considered as appropriate to provide nutrients by cannibalistic societies, but not by more traditional societies. Consecrated host or wine might not be considered as appropriate as a way to provide nutrients or to provide organoleptic experience by Catholic people, because that's not, what it's supposed to be. It has like a liturgical role. but it might be considered as appropriate for consumption for nutrients by people who don't have the same. Okay, now let's come back to the question, original question, what is food? So here I refer to this paper by Andrea Borghini and Michaela Piras. We have the reference here. So, of course, our answer to what is food will depend on our requirements, on which concept of food we want to define, because as you know, many of these very largely used concepts, you can have like a variety of things referred to by the same word. So we try here to characterize something relatively consensual. So Borghini and Piras have proposed the first candidate view, which is a physical view on food, where what is food is fixed by some natural intrinsic properties of the food items. And here we have identified like 3 dispositional properties of food: edibility, nutritiveness, and palatability. Are they necessary and or sufficient for something being food? We don't think so. Things can be edible without being food. Things can be food, even if it's poison food, but not edible. Same for nutritiveness. Human flesh can be nutritive, but is generally not considered as food. Here I'm going to take a slightly different example. Just consider unsweetened chewing gum. Unsweetened chewing gum is not nutritive, but is generally considered as food. Actually, it's explicitly considered food by the FDA and added in the definition for some reason. And things can be palatable but not food. Let's consider like some drug, a flavored drug. And something can be food but not palatable for many people. Let's consider social cloning or any other relevant example. Okay. Now, in this paper by Andrea Borghini and Nicolas Piras, they propose various views. I'm not going to speak about all of them here, but one of them is a social view of food, which we think is on the right track. So they formulate it as X is food just in case it is socially recognized as such. The thing is that here, technically, this is a circular definition because you use the term food in the definition, like such refer to the term food. So our proposal here would be to say that a food material is a material entity that bears an appropriate food role. So here we escape the circularity, and where I have reminded here what we call appropriate food role. So this seems to us as a better definition than the physical view. So a consequence of this would be that if there are some material which are unknown by humans or by any conscious being, but which are nutritive or palatable for humans, well, still it's not food. So imagine a remote planet, with kind of strange fruit which tastes good and is nutritive. Then it's not food because it's not considered as appropriate, for consumption to provide nutrients or organoleptic experiments. Also, it explains why poison food is food. Because an apple, sure, in some way a poisoned apple is not considered as appropriate, but it actually instantiates 2 types, apple and poison apple. One of them is generally considered as appropriate for consumption, to blah, blah, blah. The other is not considered as appropriate for consumption. So because of this arrow, because it instantiates the kind apple, then this poison apple would be an appropriate food role and be a food material by this definition. And also, by this definition, prohibited food is food because it is considered as appropriate by some community. If the whole humanity would become vegan, then nobody would consider it as appropriate anymore, and it would not be food the same way that cooked human flesh is not food, at least for the whole community, which don't consider it as appropriate. And then you would have also, with this definition, it could explain why chewing gum would be food, while chewing tobacco would not be food. But I don't enter into the details here, and I'm going to conclude. So, we have identified 3 central food-related dispositions: edibility, nutritiveness, palatability. None of them is necessary nor sufficient for being food. nutritiveness and palatability are involved in the definition of appropriate food role, which we think is a much stronger candidate for defining food. But here, as I said, like we need then to move further to see exactly which concept of food we want to define more precisely. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I think we have time for one question, and then we'll see if we have some general discussion time at the end of the session. So anything from the floor? Yes.
Is there any reason why you want this to have this role being appropriate food for human? This could be just a property. Why? I mean, is there an advantage in conceiving the property of being food for human as a role instead of just a property?
But it is a property, a role in BFO.
No, because it is a particular in buffer. This role is a specific dependent thing. Why having? Is there an advantage of conceiving this as a role?
You mean compared to
just having this as a general property things have being appropriate for human? Why you need to conceive them? You need to have roles. I see the importance of having these positions. I don't see the importance of having roles in order to deal with the fact that something actually is appropriate for food.
Yeah. Well, the thing, okay, here I did not have time to present everything in BFO that would be relevant. So, but as it happened, so it is a kind of property, but as it happens, it satisfies the condition for being a BFO role. That's why we call it a role. So then maybe you would have like some, you know, like some doubt about BFO's notion of role.
Yeah,
and that's why also here I emphasize that, like, more primitively, you know, what matters are the relations that define these roles. They are basically the most primitive entities here, and they are the one which explain, you know, why something can be at the same time, come back, you know, at the same time, you know, considered as food and not food at the same time. So it enables to qualify these things also. But if you take at face value, you know, like the BFO framework also, which in this case, you know, like we are like not going back to that, then it is a kind of property, but it satisfies the condition for being a role. So it's not really a question of being an advantage or so, it just like, okay, it just satisfies it. So as a matter of fact, it instantiates BFO role.
Great. I'll have other questions pitched to the document link that I sent out.
Where did you send it? Where did you send the link?
Right. So let's switch back to. So that is like, you do have to type it out.
Okay, let me just type it out.
Yeah, the recording is happening on my computer anyway, so what we do need is the microphone.
Thank you.
Okay, got it?
It's enough, yeah.
Okay, great. Right, so yeah, this first session is about introducing concepts of food from different directions, and we're switching from good hardcore ontology definitions into food processing and intermediate steps. So I've had the pleasure of knowing Michaela Kümpel for a few years. She's a postdoctoral researcher. I'm realizing I should.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Right, so Michaela Kümpel is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Artificial Intelligence at the University of Adrien, with a focus on acquiring and representing knowledge for agent applications, parameterizing robot action plans with web information to teach robots tasks in data environments, and using web information in user-supported applications, augmented reality devices. And it's amazing the kinds of work that that is doing with respect to food. So she's really into this autonomous robot being able to use different devices, understand materials enough to do cooking study. So over to you, Michaela, to talk about your processing, and I'll line up the stage. It's a PDF, looks like. Yeah, which one would you like? And you have, try to do 15 minutes.
Yes.
You have time.
I'll try. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Michaela. I'm from Bremen, and I'm working on the intersection between knowledge engineering and agent applications, and especially like how to make web knowledge graphs actionable for agents. And my overarching goal is to enable robots to prepare meals. And this means I can give a robot any meal, any recipe found on the web, in any, the robots can be located in any kitchen, in yours and mine, and it can prepare the meal with the available objects. So this is like a really challenging goal, of course. And towards this, the first step was that we looked at cutting fruits. And we developed a food cutting knowledge graph, which we presented earlier this year. And the robots can use these graphs. And I will just show the website if it works. Really, really short. So here we have, it's a website, everyone can access it. And what you can do is you can select an action, a task, like slicing and a fruit, like a banana, and then you can query the knowledge graph in the background. And the knowledge graph, what we do is we don't just collect object knowledge, but we have to connect it to action knowledge and environment knowledge in order to make the knowledge actionable for agents. And then we, the action information, like slicing, is different to halving and quartering, right? We have to translate this to body motions. And also we have to translate the object knowledge into for like actionable parameters. So what we do is like we infer object classes, we actually link this to food on the plant ontology and infer that a banana has a peel, so it needs to be peeled, and then we have dispositions and affordances. So how can this be peeled? Usually by hand. And then you will take a knife, and then you have here, you see what is the object to cut. This can be different. Usually it's in the first round, you cut the food object, like the banana, but then you might cut slices of banana or to get cubes and everything. And then here you have a position. The actual position then is inferred by the robot, but it knows the slicing position is at the end of an object and the halving position is in the center. And this is also, here you can do reinforcement learning to infer like how many cuts to make. And you can actually, so I don't know if this is not my laptop, but here you can actually run the code. It's running on our servers. So you don't need, you just need a laptop with web access, and then you can run the robot simulation here. I would just do it really quick because it's not the main topic of this talk. And if you, so here again, I can do slicing. It's loading the robot already. And this is interactive too. I can zoom in, zoom out. And then I can say, start the demo, and here you see how it's carrying a launch graph, and then it's taking the knife and slicing the apple. Okay, it's reloading the knife. You see it's cutting. So this is cool, and here in the background you see all the code, and we want people to engage in this and support us or work with us on these topics. And if you're interested, we're giving a tutorial at IFOW this year, so maybe we can work on topics together. But back to this. So what is the state of the art now? The food on work does a lot of process work, so translating processes into stats and food information. And in robotics, we usually go from actions and tasks and motions. Both usually define input and output objects in their states. And now that we are working on all these recipes, what we found is that you really don't get transients. So the idea is that here you have an ingredient, and once you pour more than one ingredient into a bowl, what do you have? It's not ingredients anymore. It's not dough yet. It's like a mass of ingredients. And I think if we want to really have robots that autonomously prepare meals, we actually need to look at transients, because then we can do better failure handling and everything. We can say if the butter has a room temperature, this transient needs to be handled differently than it has if it's cooled coming from the fridge, right? And in all these steps, we have transients actually. So when you pour the dough into the pan, you don't have a pancake yet, but it's not really a dough anymore. It's starting to, if it's hot, it's starting to form to a pancake. So, and this is what the paper is about. So what we do is, we give some formulas, what we think, how you can define transients. And I think I will not go through every of this because we are already late. But basically, what I would just say the four main formulas is if you have an input object and an output object and they are not the same, then they're transitioning from a food object to food parts, like in cutting. So you have one banana and then you have two halves of a banana, one food part and a slice. Then there's a transient. And in pouring, if you pour water into the cup, you don't have a transient really. Or as you said, maybe if the temperature is different, then yes, there also might be a transient. But here, it's like in the dough making, if you pour different ingredients. So if you perform the task multiple times with different objects, then you again get a transient. And also we have to consider external factors, heat of an oven or the pan. Then you get also get a transient, like the pancake making example. And the last formula is on how we stop processes, and this is if the output object already is there. So if you have dough, then you know the process has stopped and the transient is not existent anymore. So I hope you can see this. So this is the ontological model. How we do this is if we have the cutting task. So slicing is a task that is performed in cutting, and you have an input object, which is the whole cucumber, and then you have the result object of the food part, and you slice. and the slicing task triggers the cutting process, and this cutting process has the participant and transient. And for baking, this can similarly be done. Here you don't the input and output object are the same, and it's triggered through the external heat. And if we look at this example pipeline again of making pancakes, we can now say for an action of pouring into the bowl, we have different objects that we pour. So we know that this action triggered the mixing process, and the mixing process only stops when the doughs reach some parameters that we can now define because we know they are transients, right? And the same here, the action of pouring the dough into the pan, which is hot, triggers the baking process. And after flipping the pancake, the baking process is stopped because we now have a pancake here. Okay, so what are the benefits of this? So we have increased failure handling, we have added information about the initial conditions, intermediate, transitions, and outcomes. And for the mixing, we can now say, we can look at the transient states. We can say that there are different speeds that you have to perform, and you can check the consistency and when to complete the mixing process. We also propose an action designator in the paper that a robot can use. But future work now is to include these in more ontological models of different tasks, and then to actually use these models and in action designators for robots. And here there's still the work to do to differentiate between tasks and processes in the robot action plans. And then we will include these transients in all meal preparation plans and perform simulation and brief experiments. Other questions?
Yes. So basically, what I can understand from your work is that you find useful to relate to be able to point as an object to things that are actually changing states.
Yes.
Right? So, but it's useful to talk about that object, that it's not the original object, but also not the resulting object. Something.
Yes.
And I guess this can be very pervasive, like in many things, not only for food. So did you think also of the generalization?
Yes, I think definitely this is interesting for a lot of domains. And I think this can be generalized then. Like, I think the formulas are pretty general already. So I think with chemical experiments, this can be similar.
What I find it interesting is that if you think about the object, it's like it has the same parts.
Yes.
Right? Then the finished product has the same part as this mix. Mm-hmm. And then you're thinking, so is it the same? But it's not, because in fact what you're saying is that this transient, it has some properties that the other doesn't, because you can still see the original ingredient, you can see it's not a complete whole yet, right? So I think for this, is particularly interesting in the case of food.
Yes.
But perhaps there are other areas as well in which this can be used for material, I don't know, material mixing, this type of things. Right?
I mean, I would love to talk to people working in this area.
to see if it makes sense.
For me, it's already challenging enough to work with food.
Yeah.
and robots. So,
But it's very interesting. Thank you.
thank you.
I presume food chemistry is just one step away. As soon as you
Yes.
deal with mixtures and the doughs mixing,
Yeah.
reacting. So the chemists would have an interest in this. How is OWL ontology? Are you expressing these things in OWL, or are you having to use like Prolog or a different?
No, we're actually expressing it in all, and we're reusing parts of like the Zoma, the robotics action to environment and object knowledge ontologies, but also we're reusing food on terms and everything. But we're still in the beginning steps of modeling everything, and I think, yeah, I will push this to Fudan and try to get your feedback on the modeling aspects too, because yeah, that would be very interesting to get some different views.
Other questions? We have time for another one.
I suspect, however, that it is not natural to have these transients. For instance, when you are preparing a cake, okay, you put the cake in the oven. You say, this is the cake. Already it is not done yet. So the way linguistically we refer to these things seems to not be consistent with your assumption.
Yes.
It seems that these transients are kind of inventions, but we actually do not talk of them.
Exactly. And we were having an interesting discussion yesterday, and I think it's the case for many things we are working on that it's not in our linguistics. We think if we talk about cutting a banana, slicing a cucumber, or dicing an orange, for us it's all cutting, and we don't think about that this infers different body motions, because we somehow just do this. And if we want robots to actually perform this and these different motions and infer autonomously, we have to define some rules here. And for these cutting verbs, we actually created action groups. So the thing is, if you talk about quartering, you first halve an apple, and then you halve again the apple halves, right? Yeah, so if a robot uses this knowledge, then it knows, oh, I have two objects, both are halves. Now I need to get one of these halves and cut it again. And in the same manner, we need to, I think we need to include these transients just for a robot to know there's something in between, because right now it doesn't know. It just knows there's an input and there's an output. And I need to do something in between, but it doesn't have this information that there's an object that changes during this performance, right? But yes, it will be interesting to link this to linguistic concepts, and also like using ChatGPT and all of this will be very interesting.
So actually, because you mentioned that apple, orange, banana, so there's a lot of physics also involved in how you place the object. Like otherwise, you cannot have it and then motive it unless you put it on the flat surface.
Yes.
So a lot of those will also become a part of the action activities that you were mentioning,
Yes.
in the consistency, the temperature. So a lot of elements are part of food linguistics as such.
Yes, and also I think this edibility that he just talked about is also an interesting aspect, because we're not, right now we are simplifying a lot of aspects. We are always assuming that the like long objects like a cucumber is always placed on the docket towards the robot, and round objects we don't really have to problem. But yeah, we're simplifying a lot of things right now to make it work for all.
Thanks, Michaela. As I was telling you, robotics has lots of challenges with food ontology. It's the acid test of ontologies involving mariology, mariotopology. Okay, so next speaker. Going to the notes here. So, just a second, I have a brain just to time so we're shifting from the technical robotic challenge to what food ontology is over to a cultural idea of ontology. And I'd like to introduce Neil Sarkar, who is a PhD and has many other acronyms. So many to mention, but he's an associate professor in medical science and policy practice at Brown University. And it's Rhode Island. Dr. Sarkar's research is focused on bridging traditional knowledge with modern clinical practice through informatics, particularly emphasizing the enhancement of accessibility and integration of phytotherapeutic data into contemporary medical practice. Scholarly work additionally covers a broad spectrum of topics from comparative genomics and phylogenetic methods to trend detection and predictive modeling in clinical contexts. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Neil. Invite Neil to talk about the food as medicine ontology built on traditional Chinese medicine and genetics food actions. This could challenge our Western, so far, Western constructed food ontology. So it's forward to you on that.
And I think I sent you my slide.
Yes.
Right, so here we go. It's easier to go with that. I have an option.
Yeah, okay. I'll let you take slide.
All right, well, delighted to be here, and in some ways, coming here for two reasons. First, to challenge us to think about what food actually is, as in many ways building on the first presentation, and then ways that we can use food. The second is hopefully, as the opportunity presents itself, an opportunity to collaborate. And so this is a labor of love for me. My primary work is actually in biomedical sciences. We're actually looking at clinical applications. And this is something that I don't have time to tell you the story of how I fell into this, but it has a background that I think is important for us to appreciate. So when we think about medicine and the practice of medicine, we go back, at least from the Western perspective, we go back to Egypt and the first practices of medicine. And then if you go into some of the earliest texts about how medicine was practiced in ancient Egypt, you can't not go through a medical document and say food is a key element. And so nutrition and how people interact with food was seen by the Egyptians as a really important component of the practice of medicine. Now, of course, they also believed in wizardry, mystical phenomena as well. But if you fast forward, this is now we're talking ancient history, to the culture that I hail from. So in India, Ayurveda is actually also an ancient principle of medicine practices where food is actually core to the well-being. There are also mystical components in mythology and gods and all that coming in. But in Ayurveda, there's the principles of hot foods, cold foods, and depending on what you eat, will actually have an impact on your health. In China, similarly, there's also a phenomenon of the quality of foods have an impact on which organs they impact and how health is actually rendered. And so depending on what you eat, it will actually impact what your health status is. And in Chinese medicine, the other principle that's really important is that depending on when a patient presents, we look at, well, what is their current state? Do they have dampness? Are they sort of running hot? Things that in a Western mindset, we do clinically, but we don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about what are the things that are impacting. And this is a huge contrast between ancient medicines and contemporary medicine. So in contemporary medicine, patient presents, and our job as the medical enterprise say, okay, the patient is broken. Let's figure out how to fix it. So we give them medicines, we give them drugs, we give them surgery. Whereas in ancient medicines, it's less about where the patient is, what we can do to where the patient is going, but where did the patient come from? So this patient who's presenting, well, what are they eating? What is actually going on with this individual? Why are they feeling this way? As opposed to, how do we fix the problem? That's a huge contrast. While it seems seemingly slightly different, it's really different because in a more Asian or Middle Eastern culture, before we go to medicine, we'll first say, well, can we make some diet changes? Can we actually ask you to change your lifestyle? Now, in the contemporary world, at least in the United States, we are highly stressed. And when I go to my doctor's office once a year for my GP visit, they say, well, what do you do for a living? And they know what I do for a living. And she goes, well, you need to calm down. You need to actually think about your whole self. That's becoming a bigger trend, at least in American medicine, where we're less about treating with medicines and more about treating the patient, what we call wellness. And so mindfulness and understanding, spending a little bit of time every morning being with yourself, being quiet, and especially we're always calm. And if you think about the levels of stress that we are all impacting on us, stress actually is one of the most impactful things on our health and well-being. And interestingly, food has an impact on that stress. And at least, again, I come at this from a very American perspective, highly stressed individuals tend to have very poor eating habits. And we tend to, and I'm actually as guilty as this, as any other American, is we go through a stressful day and, well, I gotta grab something quick. We have lots of good fast food, very tasty and very quick. And I can not leave my vehicle and I can drive into a McDonald's. I can get a hamburger, I can get some fries. I can eat while I'm driving, regardless of all the safety issues with that, but I can eat while I'm driving, and I can get on to the next thing. Meanwhile, my heart is racing, my blood pressure is going. I've just consumed a lot of sodium, and I've satisfied myself. And if you go to, whether it be Egyptian, Indian, or Chinese philosophies, they would say that's absolutely the wrong thing to have done. You should have eaten a cool lunch, something that actually soothes your body to help handle the stress. And at least again, in the United States, we tend to sort of add more stress on top of stress, and diet is a big piece of this. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about allopathic medicine and its roots. And so, at least the prevailing type of medicine that we practice in the United States, allopathic medicine, does actually harken back to the ancient Greeks. The Greeks actually had 4 basic humors. So there's yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And this led to actually in early contemporary allopathic medicine to the concept of, well, if there's something off, you need to sort of adjust the balance of these 4 humors. This led to things like bloodletting, using leeches, etc. Or if you're really sick, let's just take some blood out. That'll actually help with some of the balancing. But there was also a food component in this as well. There's actually a oftentimes misquoted statement from Hippocrates that says, food is medicine. He actually didn't say that. But what he did say is nutrition is really important for the impact on medicine. And so there is actually an underpinning philosophy, even in Western medicine, contemporary allopathic medicine, that is based on food. However, we've actually long since lost that. And so my work is focused on, well, can we find a formal framework? We can at least start thinking about food as medicine, because now, if you go out into the literature and do random Google search, you're going to find lots of great information. Most of it's misleading. and much of it is really hard to determine if it's actually correct or not. On the flip side, traditional Chinese medicine actually has a systematic approach and actually is used in contemporary practice around the world. So you actually can go to a traditional Chinese medicine therapist, they'll actually walk you through this in a very systematic way. And so now me, my background actually, I did spend a long time working in ontologies and development of them, so that's something that I can actually use. That's something that actually we can actually start as a community to build a framework around food as medicine using at least one framework. And I'll get at, we can actually perhaps use this as a way to expand into future or other medical frameworks. And so in Chinese medicine, my background is built around a concept of qi, which is balance, simply. It's your life force. And in your life force, there's sort of a true life force called Zhen Qi, which is basically your resilience. And so in Western medicine, we call this resilience, which is the ability of your body to take attacks, simply put. And as what makes your resilience? Well, there's one type of qi called yuan qi, which is basically your genetics, so your predisposition for certain things. There's what you eat, which is diet, and there is air, which actually really is environment. And you can go into, we don't have time today to go into the full framework of all these things, but it's actually pretty telling that the ancients, whether you're in China, India, or Egypt, or Greece, had actually thought through what we're sort of rediscovering now in medicine. So your genetic predisposition has a huge impact on your health. What you eat has an impact on your health. And how diet and the environment, what you eat and the environment in which you live. And so in Chinese medicine, you combine those into something called Zhangqi, which actually have an impact on you as a person. So your basic wellness state. So this is what we call resilience. And then there's interventions, because as wonderful as it is that you start with a high resilience, there are things that happen to you and you need to treat them. And so to do that, there are two basic ways. The first is physical interventions. In Chinese medicine, these are things like acupuncture, different types of exercise that you might do. In Western medicine, we call this surgery, we call this therapy, and the like. And the second is Wei Qi, which is your immune system. And how do you actually impact your immune system to actually get back to resilience, get back to your natural state. And so what I teach in my medical school is our job or as practitioners, and so for future medical doctors, your job is not to treat the patient for their ills, but to make sure that you're supporting them along their way in their health journey. That's really the same principle here. So immune system, your interventions would be things like medications, like, and actually as we heard in the first presentation, not really a food substance, and that's why actually I would also argue that those should be separated out here. So what we'll be focusing on today, the last few minutes that we're in, is just how do we think about this now ontologically? How do we think about diet? And so diet or food in Chinese medicine is broken down into two major categories. There are the energetics of food, and there are the actions of food. So what does food actually have in it? It has, food has, from an energy perspective, it has the nature of food, which is what is referred to as temperature. So red meat typically is classified as something that's really, really hot. And if you think about this for a moment, if you go off and you have a wonderful lamb dinner, lamb roast or a beef roast, I mean, you think about actually how your body feels, you actually do feel kind of warm, versus something that's cool. So if you go off and have salad without onions, but just pure salad, greens with celeries and cucumbers, you feel cool. Right? So that's actually built into this framework, and so every food ingredient is categorized. And then there's taste, which actually ties to palatability, which we heard about earlier today. And these are things like salty, sour, bitter, and then, so those are the basic ways that food has energy, and then what can those foods do? Well, there's two types of ways that foods can act. There's what type of element a food is, and more precisely, what organ systems they impact. And this is actually where we think about how we interface between the food ingredient and how that food ingredient becomes an actual therapeutic. And so things that we know. So if you have lots of red meat, and even though I am of Hindu background and Indian ancestry, I love a good steak, right? But my physician tells me, you gotta, not eat so much steak because it's not good for you, because it's actually going to impact your heart. And eating too much steak actually raises your cholesterol, things like that, which we do know. And interestingly, the Chinese medicine framework actually also lays out that. It's a hot food and actually impacts your heart. So coming back now to food on, and how might we sort of think about piecing this together? As is a good ontological philosophy, you shouldn't go off and develop your brand new ontology, and you should always, as the local principles outline, you should always go off and see, is there an ontology that you can latch on your new sort of hierarchy? And food on is perfect because it actually organizes the world according to food ingredients. And so with that, what I went through is actually went through and have been going through guides that sort of lay out the architecture for food ingredients from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective. And so these are the 3 books that I've actually been going through so far. There's actually piles and piles of other books. And so one of the things that's a challenge here is that as you start to develop this kind of an ontology, there isn't a Google search or something you can go out and do. I don't know Chinese, I'm starting to learn it, and I actually have lots of colleagues who know Chinese. You actually have to go into these physical books and literally manually go through it, pull out that information. There's a little bit of interpretation that you have to make as you sort of piece that all together. And so what I'm calling family, the food as medicine ontology, will actually perhaps be having is a relationship to food on. And so far I've actually looked at 257 ingredients by hand and figuring out what are the ways to actually organize those foods. I'm going to date myself, I'm a little old school, so when we develop this kind of a thing, I have a spreadsheet now that I've actually been manually creating all this, and then eventually we'll be able to turn that spreadsheet into an owl representation. That's the ultimate goal. And so where am I going to go with this is eventually I want to also look at allopathic medicine, Greek medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. How do we actually look at those? It's a little bit harder for those because I have to spend, or we as a community have to spend a little bit of time figuring out what's the similar type of structure that we can build on and anchor onto that we can actually use for expanding food ingredients as we go forward. And then ultimately the goal is, can I now link these food concepts, food as medicine concepts, to clinical outcomes? So how do we go from anecdotes of, well, if you have a poor diet, you're putting yourself at clinical risk. I believe, and so a lot of my work is actually in electronic health records, and looking at medical records and looking at diet and lifestyle. Can I actually link clinical outcomes now to the foods that individuals are eating, and actually offer ultimately food regimens for individuals who may have maybe at risk for clinical disease, to say, here's actually a ingredient list that you could actually use for considering. Maybe I'll give it to a robot that'll actually say, please make this a regimen of food for an individual as we go forward. There were some sort of hiccups as I was going through, as I alluded to, is that so the concept of food, and this really gets more to palatability more than anything else, kind of the first concept into here again. So when we think about a tangerine, we eat the fruit part of it. But when you're thinking about medicines, and in Chinese medicine, the peel is also actually considered something that you need to consider as an ingredient. Now, while we might discard the tangerine peel, I couldn't, at least in my searching about food, find the tangerine peel by itself as something that would be considered a food ingredient. So we're going to have a couple of those kinds of items that we're going to have to sort of consider. And then there are Chinese foods that aren't necessarily in a lot of the sort of the contributing vocabularies that are giving into food. Those are actually easier. I think the harder ones are going to be these kinds of things. We would not consider them classically as food ingredients. How do we consider those kinds of items in food? So next step, I'm going to finalize the mapping to food on, and then I'm really working on starting to develop apps that actually go and create. So based on the clinical state of an individual, can I use this ontology now to provide a recommended diet for that person? That's sort of my goal for the next year. And beyond that, looking at other frameworks of medicine that we can actually sort of expand this food medicine. Hopefully I've convinced you that that food ingredients can be organized medicinally, and that formal frameworks like traditional Chinese medicine provide a formal framework for organizing those food ingredients, and that what I'm working on here with FAMO, Buddhist medicine ontology, helps organize those ingredients and actually helps provide a bridge between the ancient principles of medicine and contemporary Western medicine. Thanks.
All right, a question. We are running late, but at least a question for you. Yes.
Can you go back to the slide where you were showing the food and the organs out there?
This one?
Yeah, so I just wanted to know this action would be both positive for an organ or negative for an organ. So is that relationship also inbuilt?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things. So in traditional Chinese medicine, there are, when you're looking at an organ, there are things that will actually impact positively and negatively. Those are things that actually
Okay, well, Neil, you're talking a great segue into food characteristics, and Barton promised some terms like peel or citrus fruits and so on. So various things are coming up here. I do need the microphone though. Where's that? Great. So my talk is the last one. We would have to cut it short for the coffee break. Here's the question. Do you guys want to do a coffee break now? Then we come in with my talk and then we do the second session.
The problem is that the coffee break won't be ready.
Oh, it's not even ready now?
I don't think so. It will
In 10 minutes, right?
in 10 minutes, yes.
Oh, yes, right. I'm predicting 10 minutes from now.
Ah,
So I have 10 minutes. I can drill through my stuff, but there won't be much questioning. If you guys want to have a coffee break, oh, but it's not even ready now. So we need to use this time.
we
I will
need
present. Okay, here we go. I might take just a little chunk out. Okay, food characteristics. This has been a long-standing piece that food ontology needed. We haven't really formally tried to organize our characteristics so far. We've just done an animal template, trying to systematize anatomy times taxonomy for animals. That's doing plants times taxonomic part. But I guess I should introduce myself. Damion Dooley. I'm the ontology development lead from the Center for Infectious Disease, Genomics, and One Health at San Fraser University. And what I'm going to talk about is actually a collective work by a number of people involved in the food curation community around FoodOn and others. So their names are down there. And the paper title is officially called Physical, Organoleptic, and Taxonomical Food Characteristic Analysis for Ontologies and Research. And it's meant to be a gap analysis about what IFOW has for food vocabulary describing food and what we need to develop some kind of framework. So, just to say, talk about food characteristics, there is just a massive number of different places you could start to go in. You could be looking at the food product itself and its characteristics or its production line history. You could be looking at the context of the product in a store shelf or at home. And label claims, you could be looking at people's impressions of characteristics as they're examining foods and making decisions about buying them or using them in recipes. And there is, of course, the analysis, formal analysis of people's reactions to food in many different ways. And the ComFocus project, the presentation is going to focus on that today. Don't want to dwell on all of this stuff. Instead, I'm going to kind of circle back to what Adrien was talking about, where we're trying to bring in some of these new categories, the disposition roles, and back them up in food on. So right now we have food material, and we've had food products as a category right under that, but now Adrien's organization is making us understand we need to have a nutritious food class, which is backed up by Kevin's food nutrition role. Maybe an organoleptic food class that says underneath this, we're talking about foods that have a smell or a taste to them. We're talking about that aspect. And then hazardous foods, which have these other characteristics, such as maybe they're hiding pathogens in them, or they're too hot. So a whole variety of language needed for each of those categories. And there's some open questions. I'm just giving you a flavor for what the group might go through on a difficult call. Are the food by non-nutritional effect, is that a category we should have? I mean, we need to talk about food that has caffeine in it. Is that an organoleptic effect? So there's some discussion to be made there and decisions about that, and about are there different senses of cultural and social foods, foods based on ethnic community, for example. I'm going to just dive into talking a little bit more generally about where you might find characteristics in local foundry, family of life science ontologies. IFOW is the phenotype of ontology, and it has a lot of characteristics about material things, of which food materials are part of. And so you can see all these standard names for kinds of feature, kinds of characteristic, including pragmatic things like mass, more complicated things like structure, and then things like age, which seem to have an informational component to them, because age isn't just something you can look at, it's actually something based on knowledge from the past and present. So some of these characteristics verge into packing other kinds of information. Surface temperature, for example, IFOW doesn't have either of those terms, but we can probably need them for cooking. And that is not just a temperature, but it's a temperature of a place. Area topology. So organism material has a couple of extra characteristics. Viability of an organism, the sex, the taxonomy is a part of it, we call that a characteristic. And then food material has flavor, edibility, potability. So now some of these characteristics that Adrien was talking about. So Food On is trying to formalize this, and we've just come up with an animal template I just mentioned. Here's the plant template we're working on. If you go to Food On, you will see these relationships right now. But speaking to holding your terms in tables, part of our formalism is getting all of the slots and organizing a bunch of terms of the like kind into a table, and then pressing the button and converting it into an ontology. So you're not old-fashioned that way. So this is illustrating the Hesperidium fruit, which has that hard peel that you're talking about, Neil, and the ability to separate that out, which was what Michaela's robots need to do for us, for themselves. But the language behind that is that we need a term to point not only to an orange, but the fact that it's a certain cultivar, not just an NCBI taxon sequenced organism, but maybe even below that, out in industry, we know of these products by certain cultivar and brand names, so we need to actually have names for those. So, but what's this thing in the middle, this raw quality or characteristic? How do you define that? So now we're moving into raw, dried, frozen. What are these things that people have different vocabularies for? They're different standards for measuring these things. So if we could look at it, it's just characteristics of a very general material entity. We've got 3 minutes to chart through 10 minutes of stuff, so maybe bear with me on this. Material can be chilled, thawed, dried, or frozen without even talking about it being food per se. And that's one of the things that Foundry doesn't quite have right now. It's a general ontology for material transformation that could have these kinds of things that are actually not terms that you just sit in food on, but more general. Then we have food materials, more specific. So a term like raw really does apply to food more than any other kind of material. Fresh really applies to raw food, and there are conditions under which that's created or exists. We've got thawed, very important for food inspections. You need to know whether something might have bacteria as a result of being raw or being dried, raw, fresh, frozen, chilled. Trying to tweak these things to understand agricultural stuff in the field. Harvested materials are sometimes dried out in the field, so drying something while it's in its raw state. All of that kind of vocabulary I'd like to see in food on so that others like agro can use this as well as our own catalogs. Temperature. So yeah, when you say something is frozen, what do you mean? Well, it's relative to water. So we could be introducing into potato, the freezing point of water. It already has frozen, but it doesn't have things like fresh frozen or flash frozen that we need to describe food industry practices. Food safe chilled, chill fresh. There's tons of regulations around what those temperatures are. They vary between countries, so we need at least a food onto base jumping off point so you can go off to these different places. And then there's temperature in terms of food safety hazard, but actually more generally in terms of hazards in industry and in NASA moonshots and Mars shots. They actually have a paper on that, realizing that actually it's not just the fact you might be burned by something, but that you could feel pain just picking up a hot pan. So the robots may be able to pick up these hot pans and do all this stuff. When you hand food over to humans, are they burning themselves up? But we need vocabulary for that. And that takes us into the hazardous material area. I just mentioned temperature, hazard food materials. Just to say, there are all these processes that we know of that we can teach ourselves and robots to take hazardous food and make it edible food. So we need a little framework for vocabulary. And Food On has these minted IDs as of last week to cover this, but we're not going to go any further. We realize that there are other more specific vocabularies being developed again in other places for the rules. Physiological perception. So back to that organoleptic food, what kinds of senses are measurable? Well, we've got things straight out of potato for odor and flavor and sound quality. Seeing and touching, these are two different modalities. We've actually learned how to sense several things out of them. Being able to tell when water's boiling just by looking at it, or being able to tell when something's hot because it's steaming, looking at the texture, feeling the texture. So there's stuff to sort out there in terms of those categories, and all the taste and flavor wheels and smell wheels and that vocabulary, which is out there in non-ontological form that needs some harmonizing. Dietary characteristics, and I'm just about through here. So yes, we've got all these diets that people are following, but they're actually motivated by different reasons. So I think the Ontology for Nutritional Studies has just gotten a revamp, and it's offering up this list that actually started the Integrated Food, or the Joint Ontology for Food Work Group conversation on a monthly basis to fashion definitions for all these things. They are broken down by different kinds of diet. I just, I'll leave the list there so you can sort of get this vision on that. What we're testing out is the idea that a descriptive diet, a journal or a log of food entries, or even a description of what a population generally eats, could be described as an object aggregate of references to different kinds of foods, maybe at a general class level rather than at specific instance levels. So I'd like to partner with people throwing it out there to work on a kind of descriptive diet model where we are saying who or what eats something, and what kind of meal and when, as a knowledge graph kind of representation that could then capture not only individual diets, but characteristics of populations. There's stuff to figure out there in terms of representing frequency, and do we use the time ontology? Is it powerful enough? We have to have some other. So I'm just finishing with the fact that food characteristics might be expressed as numeric things like a temperature. They might be expressed, or an age. They might be expressed as a categorical value like hot, cold, and those may actually be backed up by formal definitions of what they mean in terms of water, sea level, whatever. We're faced with a whole universe of people doing their RDF graph knowledge bases and cooking up their own relations, their own object properties, their own data properties. Other people are focusing more on object properties, and they almost never use specific data properties in favor of the general one. So you've got to really look at in terms of taking information from a tabular view over to the siloed RDF graph, over to the ontological driven, but perhaps still siloed world, over to the what I would call the object property view, which allows us to pick apart what an age actually is as a class, rather than hiding it invisibly in the name of the relation, which therefore we have to have some kind of translation knowledge of to know whether a particular age is in years, is in trimesters, is in months after conception, or months after putting it in the ground as a seed. So that's just a note about how there are different ways to measure these characteristics, and it's good to at least formalize them in your own system. We're looking for an OVO Foundry recommended way as well to move from the data property world over to the object property world. And that's it for me for today. So 10:35, sorry, because it looks like 5 minutes. So a question or two, and then we get to do coffee. Yes.
So thank you for the presentation. And I was wondering, how this work is implemented with the for instance, how WHO groups, the system classifications on food and how they reach,
Did you say how is it implemented?
or non-food being implemented, I don't know if it's already implemented with the next classifications, like food groups classification of how and WHO.
Right. Yes, okay, so I know a bit about controlled languages. There are a few, such as Agravoc, and InFoods is an FAO supported effort. So I can say that the vocabulary in those areas discussing nutrients, foods, or analytic methods, that domain is very much the domain of the ontology, the domain of the CDNO ontology, which focuses on ontology of nutrition. And so they're trying to map the InFoods tags that mention nutrients to Foodon's KEDI, or KEDI, the Chemical Ontology Database, and to USDA's nutrients. So that's an example of an OVO Foundry ontology being a focus in a particular domain for mapping. For FAO, I know you've got that database, maybe it's not you, but FAO has a database of 12,000 fish, seafood fish by scientific name. Foodon actually wants to map to it, wants to use NCBI taxon But not all of those tissue have been sequenced, so there's a challenge of trying to map one-to-one there. And also to formalize and systematize the description of fish, some of which can be filleted and others which can't. You just don't do that, so you're not going to offer the same term all the way through. So we're working on a fish template right now to try to be that nexus and to map to USDA's, not USDA, FDA's fish list and so on. It's yeah, so just to say, agencies are backing their own offerings, and they have the power to do so. But it's really a socio-technical question of how we take these open source ontologies and figure out who has the resources to curate what. I'd like to hear your opinions about it all, too.
Well, I mean, I have an opinion, but I don't really get a solution also because the specifications are like vary over time. So like trying to do like a huge effort, like trying to align when possible, but like thinking of feasibility over time, how to maintain those classifications and those alignments when they might change, or maybe different classifications are adopted by the same agency, like so.
Yeah, run into that all the time with NCBI taxon. Every month we go back, we actually have to replace a few terms and so on. LLMs, ChatGPT, LLM, RAG systems, ontologists are trying to figure out whether, and we are like Food On, trying to figure out how much we can rely on them to help us with this mapping to FoodX2, to AgriBoc, to multilingual labels. Okay, any last question, or you just flag me down during the
We
day?
can ask during coffee.
Coffee, yes.